Good evening. So the last 2 weeks have been quite interesting on the political front in that sense that the Russian Duma has the legislative body of the Russian Federation has enacted a law where the Russian president would be able to utilize nuclear weapons or ABC weapons in the case that an enemy would target the Russian Federation with conventional weapons which were guided by, for instance, or assisted in the launching by NATO in one way, form, shape, or the other. And I thought to myself, that is an interesting thing, and that was not really broadly discussed in the Western media. I actually got that information from the Pravda, the Russian-speaking site Pravda, not the English-speaking site from Pravda. And I thought I'm going to talk about this for a couple minutes. In that sense, on how this actually works and how our system is actually structured. What I'm going to be talking about is missiles, which the United States predominantly has in their arsenal, and this is non-classified information we will be talking about here. And then I'm going to give you an idea about my ideas of the interview Gerhard Schröder, the former German chancellor, gave to Schröder Köppel of the Weltwoche in Switzerland. It's a weekly conservative news media outlet. And Roger is a very interesting person to listen to. He has interesting views, and he is a very good journalist. You may or may not agree with his political views, but as a journalist, he does an excellent job, and he's definitely noteworthy and someone to be listened to, especially when he conducts interviews. The other interview, he conducted that in Switzerland. I forgot now the name of the hotel, but it's one of the upscale hotels in Zurich, if I'm not mistaken. The Doldrin or something like this. I've never been there. Anyway, and he conducted an interview with the hereditary Prince Filip, I think. Yeah, Filip of Serbia. So, and that was an hour-long interview, and that was quite interesting there too, of what the hereditary prince had shared there in that interview. So that's the kind of the three things I wanted to talk. But let's get started with this missile business. Just a little bit about a background about myself is many years ago I worked with McDonnell Douglas out of St. Louis, Missouri. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri. And McDonnell Douglas had their main missile facility in St. Charles, St. Peter's. That's two cities east of St. Louis, right on the St. Louis River, on the Mississippi River. What river is this? Well, it's a river. That's the river Missouri, St. Louis is on. I think it's the Mississippi. No, can't remember. Terrible, but that's okay too. Anyway, St. Peter's and St. Charles. East of it, right on I-70. There is a fast underground area which has been there since the Operation Paperclip, and it is the central nervous system for the American ABC program. And I worked there through a friend of mine from the University of Missouri in Rolla, Missouri, which is about an hour southwest of St. Louis and about 6-hour drive from Kansas City. You would have to go southeast. And I got involved there with the fellows at McDonnell Douglas. I'm an electronic engineer. And I participated in the missile guidance systems for several different missiles they had at that time, and which are still in use or in active service at this point. And so what has really baffled me somewhat was the classifications what the Western news media wrote, is that we're looking at long-range missiles. A long-range missile, by its definition, would be normally classified. They're usually classified in 4 groups in general. Short range is everything up to 300 kilometers. Then you have short to medium range, 300 to 1,000. Medium to long range, which is 1,000 kilometers to about 4,500 kilometers. And then basically long range and intercontinental ballistic missiles, which go then over 4,500 kilometers in distance. The commonality of these type of missiles is that they're actually going into the stratosphere and then come back down. So they don't go flat like most missiles, which are launched, either from ground, they may make a little hump. They usually go up and come back down because of detection and anti-missile systems and so far and so on. So they shoot them more or less straight up and they come then down over the target. That's the intended purpose. They all are basically twice or even more, 7 times ultrasound, of the speed of sound, 7 times. And that kind of varies. This is all then classified, the exact ranges and the accuracies and the exact speed of these missiles. So that is really out of the question. So what we would look at here is, in terms of ballistic missiles, would be the medium to short medium range, up to 1,000 kilometers. Now, in order to understand this, is the system is set up for these weapons is a missile in itself is not a weapon. It becomes a weapon when a warhead is installed on the missile. Otherwise, it is just a missile. A missile as a missile as a missile. And it cannot do anything except go up into space and come back down, or, fly wherever you're going to direct it to. The way this usually works is these missiles, the short range and the medium short range, they can be equipped with conventional warheads that would be TNT, cluster bombs, incendiary bombs. If you want to bomb a city and you're trying to set the city or the that on fire and that sort of stuff. Cluster bombs if you want to destroy an airfield somewhere with aircraft on it, or troops out in a battlefield scenario and that sort of thing. Then comes the ABC categories, which are atomic, biological, and chemical. Now, because these missiles have no explosive power other than the fuel they're carrying, like any other missile, what's his name here, the guy from Tesla is using, I almost said Zuckerberg, but Zuckerberg wouldn't know what a missile is. The guy, can't remember his name now. Anyway, with his SpaceX program, they use missiles. NASA uses missiles, whoever is going into outer space is using missiles. And they're not weapons, as we know, they're transport mechanisms to transport something. It's the carrying vehicle, so to speak, for something to be carried over a great distance or into outer space. Or into space. Depends on how we want to look at it. So in order, because the missiles have to be loaded at one point or another, these type of missiles, with a warhead. And the way this works is pretty simple. The Pentagon and their command posts, the high commands in a battle case scenario, They have several, battle command centers here in the United States and the East Coast, West Coast for the respective sites they're going out to, and then over in Europe and the Pacific and Hawaii. There's places all around. So they make a decision according to their battle plan, what they're developing, of what they're going to send out. And that is computerized, and they enter this there at the command center. A general usually signs off on it. He looks through it, so they're going to say, we're going to send 4 regular warheads, just as an example, 10-ton warheads, TNT, on each missile, wherever they're going to try to take out a target. This is now in there, and the missile operates through the missile guidance system, which is the main brain of this thing. They get now a code into the system over networked, cable networked, not Wi-Fi or any of that stuff, but via satellite links to that particular launch pad or launch vehicle that gets downloaded. The soldiers are then instructed, usually classified, of what kind of a warhead they have to install. And each warhead has a particular ID system. So if they grab, for instance, the wrong warhead and they're mounting that on that missile, whatever missile it is, and the battle instructions which were loaded into the missile do not match the warhead, then the higher command will get an immediate alarm function and say there's the wrong warhead installed, and that warhead or that missile cannot be launched. So they would have to then unmount that warhead and get the correct warhead mounted on it. This was put into place as one of the many safety measures. So if you have, say, like a scenario where you need a conventional warhead and they're grabbing, for instance, a nuclear warhead, just as an example, that wouldn't be really practical possible, but in a worst case scenario, that would prevent that kind of a launch. And in order for this to work globally, all of this is done through satellite links. The U.S. military owns and operates, it's their own satellites, and undersea cables all around the world, and a few other technologies I cannot really discuss here, which play into this whole thing. So if the Ukraine were to get one of these ballistic missiles, which we use, which all have this system in place, the Pentagon directly would have to get involved in the launch, because they're the ones who can then actually authorize the missile to be fired. That is the scenario. And this is the reason why the Duma implemented or changed the laws in Russia on how Russia can respond with nuclear force to this kind of a threat now. So you have the Ukraine is going to launch it, but the actual activity to prepare the launch and to actually clear it for launch would have to go through the United States. And with this, a NATO partner would be directly involved in a missile launch, even though the Ukrainians have to push the button, so to speak, and it would hit Moscow, for instance. This would enable now the Russian authorities, the Russian military and President Putin, because based on the laws they got now, to actually use nuclear force in response to such an attack, however that may look like. So this is a big turning point in this whole war scenario. Now, you can get, long-range missiles, which are launched off, which are non-ballistic, which are launched off aircraft, say like an F-16, for instance. They can be programmed separately, but normally if the warhead is interchangeable to different warheads, then you have the safety mechanism in place. I don't want to say that every missile the United States has can be equipped with ABC heads, warheads, but that is the general direction. So you can reconfigure these missiles to begin with. There's only a few exceptions to this. One of them is the one of the Navy missiles that was the SLAM and SLAM-ER missile. That was one of the programs I worked with. I worked on the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile System, which is called the Minuteman II. That is the current intercontinental nuclear shield of the United States. That was several years ago when we updated this, and I worked on the SLAM-ER missile system for the U.S. Navy. There's other nations who use the SLAM-ER. ER means extended range. And a SLAM was a surface land air missile. That means they can be launched off a ship. That was the primary thing. But they also can be launched off a mobile launch pad, for instance, on land and do the same thing. And they could be modified, or there's a similar version of that particular missile, which can be launched from an F-16, just as an example. So there is multiple reconfiguration tools to make them versatile, because these weapons are so expensive that you want to get them as versatile as possible to have the greatest options available to you. That sums it basically up in a nutshell. Now, the SLAM missiles here too, all of them have to undergo a clearance, and that clearance has to come from a high command. For the Ukraine to be able to use these type of weapons, these weapons will have to be modified, software modified, physically modified. There's a lot of classified stuff in there which you don't really want the Russians to get. And this was going to take quite some time. So looking at this scenario and looking at the measures the Russian Federation has taken, it is probably unlikely that the Ukraine is going to get any type of these type of weapons. Now, the UK has their own weapons program, France has their own weapons program, Germany, there's several other countries in NATO which make their own missiles and that sort of stuff, and ballistic missiles, which may or may not work the same. But from the United States, this would be a more difficult thing to easily incorporate into the current defense strategy of the Ukraine, as Zelensky had hoped for. Yeah, let me put it that way. So we have to wait there for a while. In the war itself, it has come to this stagnation. We're now, 2 years into this, over a little bit over 2 years, 2.5 years. And this is exactly where this First World War was at, especially on the German, French, Belgian border there, where the forces were basically stagnant by 1916, 1917. It's pretty much the same scenario. A war of attrition, that's really what it is. It is the meat grinder scenario here has not changed yet in any way, shape, or form. The conquered territory there in Russia, where the Ukraine has gained and made some advances into, they have been holding that up. That really hasn't changed that much either from the map I have shown you a few weeks ago when the scenario first, when the invasion first started. They have expanded that a little bit, and the forces, the Russian forces, which I had indicated there, they have been rotated out with reserves or replenishment for the active duty people to get out of the war zone for a while to recuperate. So their rotational system is working on the Russian side in this, and the Russians also are going to increase their military. Now, I had mentioned this earlier too, that this is probably going to go on like this for quite some time, because Putin, even though he would like to be there, he is not there in his size and the power of what the Russian industrial military complex had during the heydays in the 1970s and early 1980s under Brezhnev. That's when it was the most powerful. Once Gorbachev got in there, all of the stuff started to change, and that was basically the beginning of the end, not just of the Soviet Union, but also the industrial military complex in the Soviet Union. If Putin would have had access to that machine, they would have waltzed already over the Ukraine into Poland with no issues, because just the manpower, the production facilities, everything was humming there, and that was the reason why the Soviet Union had such a huge lack of consumer products, because the entire focus under Brezhnev had shifted into the industrial military complex to compete with the United States, and as a result out of the Vietnam War. So that's basically just where that part is at. Now let me say a couple things about this with Schröder Köppel and the interview with Gerard Schröder and neocons and this, that, and the other thing. I had to smile yesterday when I watched it or I listened to it. Sometimes on these videos where people talk, I don't look at the video, I just listen to what they're saying. It is better absorbed, or I better absorb it that way, like a podcast, where you can just hear someone talk and you're kind of just absorbing it. I think the most interesting point is this. Well, if we go back to 2003, prior to the Gulf War, the Iraq War, was that Schröder and Chirac were in great support here of the United States with George Bush after 9/11, supporting the Afghanistan invasion and that sort of stuff. But then when this thing came about with Iraq, they bailed out both of them because they had consulted with Putin. And this was the split between the moderate wing of the Social Democrats in Germany with the neocons here in the United States, neoconservatives. And that was Cheney, Dick Cheney, the guy who came from Halliburton, oil and defense. So there was like that special interest in there, which they kind of didn't like. And then the Democrats kind of went against it. And Donald Trump voiced his opinion already back then, and he said he was against the war in Iraq. So this is kind of where the neoconservative movement within, predominantly in the Republican Party, there's neocons in the Democratic Party as well. They're just not as represented in numbers as they were in the Republican Party. And Donald Trump refers to these people today as the dinosaurs, or he has a different word for it. Maybe I remember it. Something to dinosaurs, or something to that tune, he calls these people. And interestingly enough, the Dick Cheney and his daughter came out a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and they endorsed Kamala Harris. And this has now pushed Kamala Harris into the group where that is acceptable for neocons to vote for her rather than for Donald Trump. So the split within the Republican Party is pretty severe. And in this interview with Köppel, Schröder said that he actually supports now, or hopes that Trump is going to win, because he's going to end the war between the Ukraine and Russia. Now, the reason why he is interested in that is this is all special interest. What we're looking at is quite simple, is the European, more so the European companies, almost everyone in Germany and France and Italy, has sustained huge financial losses with losing their operations in Russia because of the sanctions and the way these assets were transferred. And the exploding energy costs as a result out of the sanctions, with not being able to import the cheap Russian gas and oil, has put the European, especially the French and the German economies, the Dutch, the Belgian, everyone, at a disadvantage. With the exception for Orban, for Hungary, because he went a different route, and he kept going at it. So this is a political situation we're getting here, where Gerhard Schröder, who is naturally, as a social democrat, not necessarily a supporter of Trump, but yet because of his interest in the German economy and the German corporate, especially the big German multinational corporations, since he is one of their favorite persons, he has now an interest to get back into Russia to avoid the losses. They haven't fully materialized, but they're pretty much impeding. They're impending. That can come true. They will materialize at one point or another, and they have to take massive write-offs on those. So this is all coming together here. So you have now, this is why politics many times makes very strange bedfellows. And now we have Kamala Harris, which here in the United States, she is portrayed as she was like the great-granddaughter of Marx, of Karl Marx. And yet, on the other hand, you got Dick Cheney, the neocon, the biggest neocon in the United States, and his daughter, endorsing Kamala Harris. So none of this stuff makes any sense. If you look at this by the narratives you're listening to from the news media, the actual reality in this is Kamala Harris is a prosecutor. She worked as a prosecutor. It was her entry into the political world. And when you have a prosecutor, anyone who's a prosecutor who's interested in law and order is not going to be a person who's going to do a big giveaway. And with the democratic political machine, which operates, like I said before, as a Politburo, but they're heavily on the take from the corporate sector with finances, campaign contributions and this, that, and the other thing. They're getting a lot of money to it. And the best one in this whole thing is Obama. Obama came in and they said, he is a Muslim. He is, we're going to vote for him. We're going to get Obama phones. He's going to give all the poor people telephones, the Obama phone. He wasn't that kind of person. He was on the take on the corporate sector. He was getting the money, or he's getting the money now, for the deeds he did for them. And every one of them has favored the trade with China. This whole thing came about from Bush Sr., already starting with Bush Sr., going through Clinton into Bush Jr., Obama, and then Trump. All of Trump's merchandise he sells, except for his wine, is made in China too. So these people all are heavily invested in China, but yet they're talking against China. In the meantime, what has also transpired here, and that is a very critical factor, is that the Russian and the Chinese governments used to buy U.S. bonds here from the federal government, notes. So this is how the U.S. dollars, which America spent in those countries, came back to the United States through their respective countries, because the central banks eventually wind up with the hard currencies when they get converted by the local companies from US dollars into Russian ruble or the Chinese currency. And the government winds up with it. Now, instead of buying the notes, the US notes issued here by the Treasury, so we can finance the debt, They're going out, Russia and China, and they're buying gold, and they have been buying gold massively. And they're taking physical delivery of the gold. This is not just they're buying EFTs or something like this, or they're investing in the gold mines. They're purchasing the gold kilo by kilo by kilo. And all of this is shipped then from wherever they're buying it on the market into Russia and into China. They're sitting on physical gold. So while we are getting more and more debt here, and we're giving out literally worthless paper for it, the Russian and the Chinese governments are starting to back up their currencies with physical gold. And at one point or another, this is going to go, if this goes on for another 1 or 2 years, they're going to sit on so much gold, besides of driving up the gold price in that way, that the entire currencies they have can be backed by gold, some form of a gold guarantee. And then their currency is going to become even more stable, with or without Bitcoin. It's really irrelevant. And that brings me to the last thing, and that was the interview Köppel had with, I think Filip is his name, Filip, the Hereditary prince. The prince said that with Bitcoin, he made some remarks about it and, how it works and everything else. And he said it takes energy to produce Bitcoin. That is correct. But what makes Bitcoin as a investment or as a desirable security is the fact that the software, the algorithms were designed for the mining process, is that the mining becomes more and more difficult. When you have a gold mine somewhere in the world, you can mine the gold mine for so long. And usually what you wind up doing is you have to dig in deeper and deeper and deeper in the ground, which becomes then more and more difficult, more and more expensive to actually get the gold out of there. And then one day you're going to get to the bottom of this thing, and then there is no more gold. And then the gold mine is shut down. And this is basically what is going to be happening with Bitcoin. Every time they reach a certain threshold, this will get more and more difficult to mine the Bitcoins. And with this, the Bitcoins, which are in circulation, can no longer be artificially increased until it gets to the point where it becomes so complicated, where you need so much processing power that you can no longer effectively mine Bitcoins. That means the energy requirements to run all of these computers, which do the mining and the algorithms which run these algorithms, and then you get every quadrillion calculations, you get 1 Bitcoin out of it and that sort of stuff. That is going to come to an end at one point, or it's going to be so demanding that it is no longer feasible, technically feasible to put that much processing power together to keep further going. That will be it. And then you have the maximum number of Bitcoins in circulation. It cannot be increased. And this is the actual key to our fiat currency system is going to produce, is going to keep printing money. On the other hand, the Bitcoin is going in the other direction, and it will slow down, which means that the value of 1 Bitcoin is going to increase as more as our regular currency, our fiat currency, is going to increase. This is like a game you can't lose in it, because that is just the way the system is designed. And gold is similar in this, but there's more mines. In some areas you can mine it easier than in other areas. So there's more gold coming into the market or onto the market than with the Bitcoin. And this is the idea of these digital currencies, like Bitcoin and the other ones we have now, that they're going to come to an end. Then there will be no more possibly being mined by computer. And then the number of these existing Bitcoins is limited, while the fiat currency will keep increasing. So the value over a time period will always going to get greater and greater and greater. And all that tells us is not that Bitcoin is so much more valuable now. It is just we have inflated the fiat currency by design more and more and more. So if a Bitcoin 20 years ago was $10 and it is now at $60,000, it's going to be in $500,000 in another 10, 20 years from now, because we're increasing the fiat currency, but you cannot no longer mine new Bitcoins, which means that stagnates, and then the competition, the exchange rate will go up for for the Bitcoin. As simple as that. That was one thing I wanted to say. He also talked about the Kosovo and reintegrating the Kosovo because it was part of the Kingdom of Serbia. I have no opinion to it other than to what I had mentioned in my other videos about the NATO involvement in that region back in 1999, which I still think is very questionable on how that was done. Well, anyway, this video came out now to 37 minutes, and I hope you found it interesting, and we shall see you again. Have a great evening.